This is the story of Nahuel Costamale, town of San Carlos, Mendoza. Being young parents and moving to a remote place with a newborn baby was not easy. My name is Nahuel, and I had my first child at 18. At that time, my partner was the same age as me. We lived in a small town and were like any teenage couple. Sometimes we would skip classes to be together. She stayed at her aunt's house since her parents lived high up in the hills. We met at school, and although I was always shy, I dared to talk to her. Maria was beautiful and always smiling. I remember one afternoon on the school bus, we sat together and started talking. I felt lucky that a girl like her was interested in me. Her aunt barely paid us any attention, which made our dates easier. My parents weren't very watchful of me either. Over time, we grew closer and closer. I really enjoyed her company and looked forward to every moment we spent together. It all started very timidly. We began by holding hands, then came the kisses. And well, we also progressed to the next stage. I won't say she was my first, but with Maria, it was different. I don't know why, but I was very concerned about her and wanted to make sure she was comfortable. We had been dating for almost 3 months when the day we feared arrived. Worried, Maria told me almost crying that she had missed her period. We were old enough to understand what that might mean. To clear up doubts, we bought a pregnancy test, and she took it. After class, she asked me to accompany her. I remember her expression. She had teary eyes. After a silence, she told me, "We were expecting a baby. We were both very scared. Neither of us was prepared. But there wasn't much to do." I hugged her and told her not to worry. In my teenage mind, I was sure everything would be all right. I remember when I told my parents. I arrived home, very nervous. My mom was in the kitchen, making tortillas, and my dad was enjoying his meal. I kept coming in and out, feeling my mother's curious gaze and my father's somewhat distant attention. I was tremendously embarrassed, anticipating a scolding or even being thrown out of the house, but the reality was the opposite. They didn't seem surprised at all. I would almost say they perhaps expected it. The situation with Maria was a bit more complicated. We waited for her parents at her aunt's house. It was the first time I met them. My legs were shaking with fear as we entered the house and faced them in the kitchen. Her father looked at me in silence for a long while, and her mother barely said anything. However, in the end, they supported us. Frankly, everything turned out much better than we expected. My parents told me I had to take responsibility, so I left school and started working. I got a job at a factory, but my earnings were not enough. Then Maria's parents started to help us. Maria moved into my house. She was calm, and my mother was attentive to all her needs. It was the first time she was going to be a grandmother, which excited her greatly. Maria's pregnancy was quite complicated. We went back and forth from doctor to doctor, and it was all very costly. The money was not enough. Although our parents were helping us, I was very embarrassed. The day came when Maria gave birth. She was sitting on the couch, a bit delicate the last few days, but we weren't too worried. Suddenly the pains began, and we quickly ran to the doctor. When the boy was born, both families were radiant. He was a big and healthy boy, and we were all excited. My in-laws couldn't stop pampering the baby, and I didn't know how to feel seeing my son so small in my arms. A wave of emotions overwhelmed me and just made me cry with happiness. My in-laws wanted us to move to the ranch with them, but both my wife and I decided to spend a week at my parents' house in case any complications arose. Fortunately, everything was going well. The baby cried, as is normal for a newborn, but our hours of sleep were significantly reduced. Tiziano was most hungry during the early mornings. The household expenses continued to increase, as the childbirth had left us somewhat exhausted, and my parents were taking care of almost everything. I didn't want to continue burdening my parents with more expenses such as diapers and milk, which were a significant cost. One night, Maria suggested that I go work at the ranch with her father, since he was getting older and it would be beneficial for us. Additionally, we would help out on the farm. Although the idea of working with my father-in-law did not fully convince me, I felt indebted to him for all his help. Besides, I didn't have many options, and Maria was very insistent that it could be a good idea. However, my mother disagreed. She was a very religious person and had doubts about whether moving to the hills was a good idea. The child had not yet been baptized and was only a few days old. I told my mother that the baptism could wait, that there was no rush and that we still had plenty of time for that. I tried to reassure her, telling her that there was no problem and that I would try to visit her as often as possible. The area where my in-laws lived was quite isolated, with only a few scattered houses several kilometers away. The road there was also not in very good condition, and as the baby was almost newborn, we had to drive very carefully. It took us almost 2 hours to get there. My in-laws' house was divided into 2 parts, the original house where they lived, and the newly built part, which included a bedroom and a small bathroom intended for us. I appreciated this a lot, as despite living in the same place, we would have our own space. In the surroundings, there were corrals and some crops belonging to my father-in-law. About 15 minutes on foot, there was a small stream, and if you went down the hill, you reached the river. Maria was very happy. She liked the idea of returning home, at least for a while. Seeing it as something temporary, everything seemed to fit perfectly. I was already in talks with one of my brothers about the idea of moving to Rosario, waiting for a quick response to start a new life and provide more opportunities for my son. Although the room on the ranch was very nice and cool, quite different from the heat of the town during the nights, our little one fell asleep quickly, while I had a harder time falling asleep as I was not used to it. I thought that over time I would get used to it. In the first few nights, I woke up to noises outside our room, which had a tile roof, allowing sounds to enter easily. I remembered how it sounded, as if a bird was flapping above our room. I thought it might be a chicken, but on one occasion the noise was so loud that I got out of bed. However, looking around, my wife and baby were sleeping peacefully, so I decided not to pay attention to it and try to sleep again. The next day, while milking with my father-in-law, I thought about asking him if he had heard anything, but I decided not to bother him with unnecessary questions. The following night, I heard the same sound again, but this time I didn't think it was a chicken. It was a stronger flapping. I went out to the backyard, saw a large tree, and noticed a black lump on one of the branches. I couldn't make it out clearly due to the dim light, and I remained looking for a while, but the lump did not move. Suddenly I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, which startled me. I turned around and saw it was my wife, who asked me why I was up at that hour. I told her about the sounds I had heard outside the house. Rocio asked me to go back to sleep, so we returned to the room where the baby was already awake. Rocio began to feed him, and shortly after we fell asleep again. When we got up the next morning and went to the corral, we discovered that the cows were outside because the gate was open. My father-in-law and I quickly herded them back inside. I asked him if this happened often, and he explained that it usually did not, as the gate had a lock, but it could be that one of the cows had pushed it open. As the days went by, the noises continued at night, but it no longer sounded like someone was on the roof. Rather, it was the animals that seemed restless. My wife was not bothered by these noises. I guess she was used to them. Our baby only woke up occasionally, mainly when he was hungry, as the night sounds seemed to soothe him. One early morning, we heard a loud thud outside the room. We woke up frightened, and when I went out, I discovered that a cow was banging against the wall of our room. Initially, I thought the corral gate had opened again. I considered telling my father-in-law, but decided I could handle it myself. However, The cow resisted moving toward the corral and continued banging against the wall. It seemed to be afraid of approaching the large neem tree that was next to the corral. During the night, the tree looked imposing, and for some reason, the cow simply backed away, refusing to get closer. Suddenly, I heard a voice from the door and looked up to realize it was my father-in-law. I explained that the cow was resisting returning to the corral. He came over to check and informed me that the corral gate was closed, something I had not noticed. Confused, we opened it and managed to get the animal inside, which caused a commotion among the others. At that moment, I heard my baby cry and quickly returned to the room where my wife was feeding him. I mentioned that the noise was being made by a cow banging against the wall, but I preferred not to go into details. I lay down next to her and kissed her on the forehead. The first month went by quite peacefully, except for the noises at night. Although being a first-time father presented its challenges, Tiziano cried a lot during the day, and we didn't know why. Often I would get up early to work and also had to wake up in the early hours to feed him his bottle. Moreover, we had to milk the cattle very early, at 5 in the morning. Sometimes I felt tired and struggled to stay awake while milking. The ranch was surrounded by trees, and on one occasion while milking, I noticed a lump among them. I thought it might be my father-in-law's pet, a black mixed-breed dog named Lolo. It wasn't fully dawn yet, so I couldn't see clearly, but I watched it for a few seconds before the shadows covered it. Shortly after, the cow became nervous and knocked over the milk bucket, spilling it. I quickly got up to prevent too much from being wasted. That morning, I completely forgot about the dog. 2 more nights passed. While returning from feeding the chickens, I saw it again. This time, it was standing on a rock, looking towards the house. That's when I confirmed it was not my in-law's pet. This animal stood differently, with a stiffer posture, and was considerably larger. I stepped back, thinking it might be a coyote or another forest animal. When it noticed my presence, it watched me for a few seconds and then disappeared among the trees. During dinner, I mentioned to my father-in-law what I had seen and suggested that it might be the reason for the cattle's restlessness during the early hours. He replied that the next day he would go out to try to hunt it down or at least drive it away from the property. When our son turned 40 days old, we organized a small ceremony in the village church. We looked for the future godparents and spent the afternoon celebrating at my parents' house, all in an intimate and calm manner. I was amazed at how quickly time was passing and how much my baby was growing. However, by evening, my in-laws had already left, and we planned to stay at my parents' house. However, my father's sister was also going to stay there, and honestly, I didn't feel comfortable with many people around, especially with our son being so small. I suggested to my wife that it would be better if we went to her parents' house while it was still early, even though the sun was already setting. My mother didn't think it was a good idea and expressed concern for our safety, but I assured her that I would drive carefully. Although she wasn't convinced, she didn't say more about it. My father also tried to persuade us not to take his grandson away, but he understood our reasons when I explained them. We left the village around 6 p.m., with me driving and my wife holding the baby in her arms. The road was in poor condition, so I had to drive slowly, with only the car's lights illuminating our path. It wasn't long before we were close to arriving when I noticed a peculiar glow to my left in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was a firefly, but as we moved forward, it seemed to be following us. I didn't know how to explain it, but I had the feeling that it was getting bigger. I decided not to worry my wife, but I started to get nervous. After a while, she also saw it and was confused. I asked her to look through the mirror, and she saw the sphere moving behind us, which puzzled her even more. When I asked her what she thought it was, she mentioned that when she was a child, her mom used to say that those fireballs were witches. This left me baffled, as I had never heard such a thing. My wife tried to explain to me that such phenomena were common in the past, although her family had never experienced it, but other people from different towns had. Her tone of voice made me feel even more nervous, even though the idea of witches made no sense in my mind. I decided to increase our speed to get away, but despite this, the thing kept following us. It seemed to get closer as we moved forward, and even though I tried to go faster, it felt like we were barely making any progress. My wife asked me to slow down, but by that point I was scared. She said nothing while she clutched the baby tightly. Soon the little one began to cry, and I drove over a pothole without realizing it, causing the truck to jolt and nearly making the baby fall from my wife's arms. I looked in the rearview mirror and noticed that the fireball was no longer there. I asked my wife to also check, but neither of us saw it. I slowed down, but couldn't take my eyes off the mirror, fearing it might suddenly appear. After what seemed like an eternity, we arrived home, both of us very scared. When my in-laws saw us enter, they asked what happened, as we were supposed to stay at my parents' house. I told them there were simply too many people and we thought of returning. But my wife explained what we saw on the road: a fireball. My mother-in-law was very scared and claimed that a witch had followed us. Despite my father-in-law's attempts to calm her, she was sure of what she was saying. After this incident, my wife began to feel uncomfortable at home, especially with the baby. She felt she couldn't leave him alone even for a moment. Once she left him for a few minutes to go to the bathroom and, upon returning, saw that the baby had moved as if someone had dragged him. She suggested it might have been my mother-in-law, but she affirmed she hadn't entered the room at that time. These events left us unsettled and without a logical explanation. In the following days, things began to calm down gradually. When our baby turned 2 months old, we organized a small barbecue by the river on my in-laws' ranch. It was just them, my parents, and us. We brought a hammock to lay the baby down, hanging it between 2 nearby trees to ensure he was safe while he slept. Before leaving him, I made sure to tie the hammock well so it wouldn't fall if he moved. While my dad, my father-in-law, and I were grilling the meat, my wife chatted with the others. She was in charge of the baby and checked on him occasionally. At one point, I noticed movement near where the baby was and saw that the hammock was untied. I quickly approached and found him asleep. My heart was pounding. I thought I had seen a black lump near him, but I said nothing. I carried the baby in my arms and didn't leave his side after that. After this incident and what we had experienced, I began to feel a great mistrust, especially when leaving my wife with the baby. I always insisted that she take very good care of him and never leave him alone for any reason. Additionally, the noises on the roof of our room became more frequent, and I had trouble sleeping. As a precaution, my mother-in-law suggested sprinkling salt over the roof of our room to remove bad energies. Although my father-in-law seemed a bit annoyed by the suggestion, we decided to do it that same afternoon, thinking that we had nothing to lose and that it was better to prevent any problems. That night, while I was at the ranch, I noticed that the chickens seemed restless. Normally, when they were getting ready to sleep, they perched in one of the courtyard trees. However, this time I heard someone shaking the tree branches, causing a lot of noise among the chickens. Fortunately, we didn't hear any sound on the roof of our room, as if whatever was causing those noises couldn't get close, but it seemed desperate to do so. Everything felt out of place and strange. I had already talked with my wife about the possibility of moving back to town. I felt it was not the best place for our baby, and we also needed to baptize him. Although she agreed, we didn't know how to tell her parents, who had been very good to us. Moreover, we lacked nothing at the ranch. My father-in-law had asked me to corral cows in a remote area, so I mounted his horse to save walking. It was late, and I only had the light of the moon. I felt uneasy among the trees. Then everything fell silent. Only the sound of the horse was heard. Suddenly, I heard movements and stones falling on me. Someone was throwing them. I was nervous and spurred the horse to go faster, but I didn't know the way back. I felt something dark among the trees. Luckily, I reached the river and felt relieved to go no further. As I was in the middle of the river, the only sound I heard was the water running. I looked back with the lamp, and what I saw left me horrified. A woman's figure with long hair and pale skin, reflected by the light. I couldn't see her face, but her posture disconcerted me. She seemed ready to jump into the water. I screamed so loud I was very nervous and afraid that the animal would lose control and throw me into the water, leaving me trapped. Time seemed to stop as I tried to move as fast as I could. Despite having only the moonlight and some branches hitting my face and arms, I didn't care. When I finally arrived at the backyard, my legs barely responded and my in-law's dog began to bark, signaling my arrival. Upon entering my in-law's house, I found Maria and asked her to be quiet as I told her everything I had seen and what had happened to me. When I took off my shirt, she could see the marks from the stones on my back. I begged her not to say anything to her parents, as I just wanted to leave there with her and our son. Although she was scared by my expression of fear, she knew I was telling her the truth. The next day, I spoke with my in-laws and told them I'd gotten a job in town. It was evident they knew I was lying. Fortunately, they understood and didn't inquire further. Although they didn't seem angry, they appeared a bit sad. I guessed they had grown fond of our little one, and that leaving the house also meant saying goodbye to him. They understood it was best for our baby. That same afternoon, my mother-in-law approached me and handed me a small card with a prayer, expressing that she understood why we were leaving and that it was best for her grandson. At that time, I was still waiting for my brother's response, hoping to move to the United States to seek a better life. A few days later, we baptized our little one. We wanted it to be a simple ceremony, but my father insisted on inviting his entire family from the town. Now my son is 30 years old and I am about to become a grandfather for the second time. I still remember that period of my life and shudder to think about it. I don't like to consider what would have happened if I had stayed at my in-laws' house. Honestly, I am very glad I made the decision to leave. Although I had never believed in such things before, it's experiences like this that make me question everything. We hope you enjoyed the video. If so, give us a like and don't forget to activate the bell to receive all our notifications.